Dr. Martin Luther King was a complicated man with an even more complicated legacy. It's difficult to imagine a civil rights movement without his moral and strategic insight. He was an American prophet. But there's also a deep sense of pain in his legacy. When he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, at the tragically young age of 39 years old. When we look back on the dreams unrealized, our hearts can be overwhelmed with grief. Or so much optimism and so much despair from the story of one man. King's legacy of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience is one of the brilliant gems of American history. He didn't originate the ideas or the strategies, but he gave them new life. Arrested for his involvement in protests, King penned the Civil Rights Manifesto, letter from a Birmingham jail. If you haven't read it, or if you haven't read it since you were in school, I really encourage you to pick up a copy. It's worth the time. The letter is an eloquent defense of civil disobedience addressed to a group of white clergymen who had criticized his tactics. It's a hauntingly relevant read for our time still. King kept a close eye on Gandhi's work in India, and both King and Gandhi borrowed heavily from the writings of Henry David Thoreau. Like I said, King didn't originate civil disobedience, but he gave it life and a power as he wove together the Christian message of love and liberation with an unflinching look at systemic oppression in the United States. His leadership ushered in a time of tremendous progress. In 1954, African American children gained access to really equal education. In 1956, the Supreme Court desegregated public schools. And of course, we know he was instrumental in leading the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It's estimated that 200 to 300,000 people gathered peacefully to shed light on the injustices against Black Americans. I want to pause for just a minute to observe the contrast here. 200 to 300,000 people gathered peacefully because they were systematically refused the right to vote. At that point, segregation was still rampant in the South. Employers could legally discriminate based on race. Landlords could legally refuse housing to Black people. Black people were treated as a completely different class of human beings, and hundreds of thousands gathered peacefully to air their complaints. Compare that to what we saw 2 weeks ago at the Capitol. The March on Washington was a watershed moment, and it laid the path for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, religion, sex, and national origin. The following year, 1965, the Voting Rights Act outlawed the discriminatory voting practices of Southern states, effectively giving African American people the right to vote. There was so much progress in those years. But the story isn't complete if we only talk about the victories. As I said, King was assassinated at 39 years old. That wasn't the only attempt on his life. He had previously been stabbed in another assassination attempt, and as most of us know, the King family's home had been bombed. And it wasn't just the KKK who hated King. Most of the country did not like him. Jackie Kennedy, in interviews that she knew were being recorded, said, "That man's terrible." By the time King died, the white establishment had rejected him, and younger Black activists dismissed him as too gentle. He was not loved by most, and he was hated by many. And his dream, his beautiful dream that we so often quote, in many ways reminds us of how horribly short we have fallen. I just looked up some of the statistics this week. Today, the typical white family has 8 times the wealth of the typical Black family and 5 times the wealth of the typical Hispanic family. The US education system that we pretend has been integrated and become equal is one of the most unequal in the industrialized world. And students routinely receive dramatically different opportunities based on social status. The wealthiest 10% of US school districts spend nearly 10 times more than the poorest 10% of school districts. Despite those stark differences in funding, teacher quality, curriculum, class sizes, the prevailing view is that if students don't achieve, it's their own fault. And ironically, the justice system may be one of the areas that displays the most racial disparity. Reflecting on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. may give rise to either optimism or despair. That's part of what we're talking about this month. Desolation, despair, that feeling of emptiness. It may be occasionally unavoidable, but it is no place to stay. Sometimes I hear people land in despair when bad things happen. It may arise from looking at differences that seem intractable. It may involve focusing on the colossal forms of oppression that still exist while ignoring that some progress has been made. It may look like throwing your hands up at the broken democratic system that looks more like an oligarchy every day. But my response to this is always the same. Okay, if people are terrible, if the system is broken and there's no hope, I guess we just go home and give up. That's the only logical next step if you really think the situation is beyond repair. Go home, pop some popcorn, and watch the country implode on your television. That doesn't seem like a very viable option on Martin Luther King Jr. Day or any other day of the year. Utter despair is not where we belong. King also warned us, though, against blind optimism. A large portion of the letter from a Birmingham jail was directed at white clergy people and white moderates who wanted to stand by and to wait for change and progress to come on their own. King warned that for too long, good people assumed that there was something inherently positive about the passage of time. People assumed that progress was inevitable. He said, human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of people willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. There's nothing inherently positive about the passage of time. Blind optimism is as dangerous as despair. Both ultimately lead to shirking our responsibility to build the world we dream about. One, because it seems impossible, the other, because it seems inevitable. Between those extremes of despair and optimism, King calls us to keep moving along the narrow path of hope. Hope isn't the conviction that everything will turn out all right in the end. It's finding meaning and courage in our efforts to bend the world toward love, mercy, and justice. Hope acknowledges the horrors of the past and the obstacles that still lay in the way, but it keeps on going, one more step at a time. Justice isn't something that, once achieved, can be set on a shelf to collect dust. Democracy is not a final destination that we can arrive at and finally relax. Justice and democracy are ideals. They're things that we will keep working for decade after decade and generation after generation. King is known mostly for his work in the civil rights movement, but once the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed, in the final years of his life, he pushed toward a broader vision. He spent the last year of his life urging fellow activists to join together to confront the crushing poverty in America. Part of the effort would be another march, the Poor People's March on Washington. His vision was to bring poor people to Washington, D.C., forcing politicians to see them and think about their needs. I love this quote from him. He said, "We ought to come in mule carts, in old trucks, any kind of transportation people can get their hands on. People ought to come to Washington, D.C., sit down, if necessary, in the middle of the street and say, we are here, we are poor, we don't have any money, you have made us this way, and we've come to stay until you do something about it." The Poor People's March on Washington was staged in May of 1968, just a month after King was shot. It was a multiracial, multicultural project including African Americans, whites, Asian Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans, all joined together to alleviate poverty. Poverty that was a huge problem at the time. Before the march, King announced the specific demands. They were asking for, I should say they were demanding, $30 billion in anti-poverty relief, full employment, guaranteed income, and the annual construction of 500,000 affordable residences. I lift up this piece of King's legacy because it's important to remember how he kept pushing for a broader vision, even after those specific civil rights measures had been won. For King, progress wasn't about one piece of legislation or one group of people. Progress was about an orientation toward life, leaning toward the ideals of justice and equality. It's so easy to get stuck in one moment, either a moment of success or failure. To keep hope alive, King reminds us to keep a broader perspective, to remember we're part of a movement. Generations before us got us to where we are, and generations after us will continue the work of justice. That long road isn't meant to discourage. Yes, we have work to do, but we can celebrate those who came before us and find hope in the fact that others will come along to pick up what we weren't quite able to complete. One of the most poignant speeches Dr. King ever made was the one he delivered in 1968, the night before he was assassinated. It was his mountaintop speech. He said, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything." The timing of that speech, the night before his death, is poignant. But this wasn't the only time he made reference to Moses's final days, looking from the mountaintop to see the promised land. Like King's powerful dream speech, this is a portion of speech that he had used on multiple occasions. King didn't tell us his dream or talk about his view from the mountaintop to elevate himself, to talk about himself as a singular holder of the vision for a better future. He invited us to join him in a dream. He invited us to join him on the mountaintop. He beckoned us to look toward the future, to dream of what is possible, to work hard toward that future, even if it may not come to pass in our lifetime. He gave us a model of maintaining hope that is safe from the dangerous pitfalls of despair or naive optimism. Maintaining hope is a discipline. I know. This past couple of weeks, I have been dragged down into despair, only hours later to have my heart soaring with the optimism of easy answers. Maintaining hope is a discipline, but it's what we're called to. For Dr. King, for justice, for our children, for our country, for the survival of our spirit. We're called out of the pit of despair, out of the paralysis of naive optimism, to walk down a narrow road of hope. Amen.